So dear audience, we have the next plenary session, Entangled Englishes in Translocal Spaces. The plenary title is Language Question in Bangladesh, Class Capitalism and Colonialism. So our plenary speaker is Dr. Azfar Hussain from Grand Valley State University, Michigan. To give a brief biography about Dr. Azfar Hussain, I'm sure everybody knows him, but still, I would like to again say something about him. So Dr. Azfar Hussain is a Bangladeshi American theorist, critic, academic, bilingual writer, poet, translator, and public intellectual. He's currently director of the graduate program in social innovation and associate professor of integrative, religious, and intercultural studies at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. He's also vice president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, known as GCAS, based in New York, and GCAS professor of English, world literature, and interdisciplinary studies. Some of his noted book publications are The World in Question, Essays in Political Economy and Cultural Politics, The Politics of Postcolonial Subjects, Sites and Scenes, Micronarratives, and other essays. In addition to authoring, editing several books, Dr. Hussain has internationally published in both English and Bengali hundreds of academic, popular, and creative pieces, including translations from several non-Western languages. His latest book in Bengali, called Darshanakhan, Philosophical Narratives, is an interdisciplinary intervention in the fields of contemporary politics, culture, literature, philosophy, and the philosophy of language. It's an absolute honor to have Dr. Azfar Hussain with us. I would now request him to begin his plenary session, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today here. And so let me begin by saying that the title of my talk has slightly changed. It's no longer the language question in Bangladesh, but it is the question of language. The question of language, class, capitalism, and colonialism. So I have three epigraphs to my talk, and the first one, my first epigraph, is taken from the Italian Marxist, Leninist, theorist, activist, and revolutionary Antonio Gramsci. And he puts it this way, I quote Gramsci: "Every time the question of language surfaces, it means that a series of other problems are coming to the fore," unquote. Now, my second epigraph is from the Caribbean anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon. I quote, "To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture," unquote. And the third epigraph is from the African writer and theorist activist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and I quote Thiong'o here: "What is at stake is language as more than a simple means of communication. English is the means of taking people away into the sphere of modern capitalism," unquote. Well, I have only 25 minutes here, I think, and within 25 minutes, I can only present just a tiny segment of my otherwise sustained project on the language question with regard to English, of course. So yes, language, like money, is the medium of exchange. The comparison also tells us that language itself is not money as such, although both have certain qualities in common, exchangeability, for instance. But does language itself beget money? It can, and it does. Indeed, language itself is a site of struggle. V.N. Volosinov / Bakhtin is right when he asserts in Marxism and the Philosophy of Language, I quote, "Sign becomes an arena of the class struggle," unquote. I quote James Joyce here also: "The war is in words," unquote. He declares this in Finnegan's Wake, while deliberately morphing syntax into what he himself calls syntax, by citing Volosinov and Joyce together, I underwrite with full force Frantz Fanon's assertion, made in black skin, white masks. I quote Fanon here. I ascribe a basic importance to the question of language, unquote. Now, I intend to bring together and cross-read 4 different forms of what Gramsci and the British Marxist cultural critic Raymond Williams, on almost similar registers, call cultural productions. A poem, a cartoon, a multinational company's ad, and a personal anecdote. In fact, I want to advance a symptomatic, Gramscian Fanonian cross-reading of such cultural productions to provide a theoretical framework within which I wish to examine the production and circulation of not only the English language as such, but also what have come to be known as global Englishes today. So first, the poem itself, a prose poem, one by the politically engaged oppositional South African poet Alexis Newndai. Newndai's poem is suggestively titled, Stick Your Good English. And you ready for the next part of the title? Ready? Stick your good English up your ass. That's the title of Newndai's poem. Newndai's is very suggestive, and I find the poem not merely Calibanesque in the Shakespearean sense, not merely provocative, but also significantly politically elusive and even theoretically enabling. So the poem here, watch, it's a prose poem, watch your language, screams our English headmaster, our guardian, our police, language please, please, but I ain't gonna please, and I ain't no slave, and I don't give a fuck. And I scream back, stick your good English up your ass, 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 stick your good English up your ass. Watch your accent, get your accent right, screams our housemaster, our linguistic watchdog, our accent police, our foreign educated English professor in our own goddamn courtyard, forgetting his mama, forgetting his mama's tongue, forgetting his mama land, motherland. And I scream back, stick your accent up your ass, up your ass, up your ass, up your ass, up your ass. Stick your right accent up your ass. And screams our brother Smith, who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war? And screams our sister Anzaldúa, we pee on your linguistic terrorism. We are your linguistic nightmare, your linguistic aberration, your linguistic mestizaje, the subject of your burla. Because we speak with tongues of fire, we are culturally crucified. We speak an orphan tongue, but our tongue. So stick your good English up your ass, up your ass, up your ass, up your ass. Stick your good English up your ass. Stick your good English up your ass. So this poem, one that explicitly alludes to 2 oppositional anti-linguistic imperialist figures, such as the Welsh poet, artist Ray Smith, and the Chicana lesbian poet activist Gloria Anzaldúa, also forms the basis of an essay called Englishes in the Era of Multiculturalism that the poet Alexis Newndai himself wrote quite some time back in 2003. There, Newndai mentions his own poem and maintains, and I quote, "We have been given the illusion that we live in the age of global Englishes that have challenged the domination of the English language itself, or say King's English or Queen's English." True, true. We have to be careful about the fact that not all Englishes are alike. There are still many Englishes that, in the name of difference, and sometimes fetishizing difference, keep contributing to the hegemony of English itself, doing violence to many national languages and vernaculars across the third world, unquote. I find Nyundai's points politically and theoretically significant. Indeed, even in highly experimental English-breaking Englishes, speakers and creative writers can say things which, while responding to the logic of the market of multiculturalism, I find multiculturalism is an assimilationist hegemonic project. And we have talked about it quite a lot. I mean, this discourse of multiculturalism is pretty old now, and even the critique of it is quite old. So this may still end up producing and reproducing hegemonic, elitist, people alienating images and ideas in the service of what Robert Phillipson quite some time back called English linguistic imperialism in his book called Linguistic Imperialism that came out in the year 1992. I know many of you are familiar with it already, but I just have to mention this and to refresh, your memory about that. Also, critical applied linguistic Suresh Kanagraja almost similarly dwells on the notion of so-called multicultural Englishes in his book called Resisting Linguistic Imperialism in English Teaching. I will take up later the question of English linguistic imperialism, rather what I wish to call English linguistic late colonialism that tends to turn many of our English departments themselves, if not all, many of our English departments themselves into micro colonies. Let me then move on to the second form of cultural production mentioned earlier, a cartoon. In fact, Nyundai's Nogugi-esque poem itself and his poem Inflected Points, emanating from the essay I cited earlier, rightly lead us to a language cartoon, one produced by Mexico's leading political cartoonist, El Fisgon. The cartoon in question targets a westbound English professor based in Mexico, one who for me is immediately reminiscent of the kind of professor our poet Jivanananda Das himself famously, but sardonically and even subversively depicts in one of his poems. In fact, there are those, as you know, who continue to be the ones who are out there to police your accent. I myself wrote a long prose poem in Bengali. Later on, it was translated into English, and in English translation, it is called Dhaka and Dirty Dialectics, whose first line is this, and I quote myself unabashedly, admittedly. So, first line, forgive me, sir, if my accent falls on the wrong syllable, unquote. No doubt I was inspired by El Fisgon's cartoon to compose more lines, which I think I should quote to make my points here. So you ought to use good English. It's a prose poem. I'm quoting from my own prose poem. You ought to use good English to attract foreign presses and foreign critics. For Allah's sake, hold your tongue and conserve the purity of your metaphors. Don't ever mix them higgledy-piggledy. Politics, boring. It contaminates your poetry and prose alike and even makes them stink like a pile of pig shit. So forget political economy. There is no time or space for your friggin' big mouth Qazi Nazrul or your Marx-Lenin freak, Nazim Hikmet, or your cranky commie Roque Dalton. But take lessons in verbal economy. Key, your profit lies in making the maximum of meaning out of the minimum of words. And oh yes, make it a point to clean up all your phrases and wipe their arses before they stand up for saying prayers to the West or Washington or Wall Street. And be sure that you don't rock the boat of those mullahs at this dangerous time. The scale upon scale commandments accumulate in the name of good English, good poetry, good prose, good criticism, good manners, good morals, and good God. Just to grind out your stanzas or paragraphs according to the golden rule. So the cartoon in question indeed makes fun of the golden rule itself, making the point that the British black poet David Dabydeen also makes in his politically charged essay instructively titled Of Not Being Milton, Nigger Talk in England Today, and I quote, the age of the dictionary is also the age of slavery. Think of the English 18th century, An Elphisgos cartoon is further accompanied by a caption that reads, and I quote, "If there is no such thing as English today, then there are Englishes. And thus we have not less, but more and more Englishes," unquote. Certainly, this caption clearly attests to, although it does not seem to celebrate the global spread and diversity of English, but the real and even the high voltage celebration of the global spread of English comes neatly packaged in an ad circulated by a US multinational company. The ad says, I quote, "English, like God, is everywhere," unquote. God? Yes. Powerful? Yes. Do we have to worship this godlike English? The suggestion is yes. The deification of English has, of course, an infinite number of milder variations or versions, or even highly sophisticated versions, culturally and hegemonically circulated through various social and institutional conduits and circuits, overdetermined as they are. Even the suggestion sometimes is this: English first, content later, as Vaidehi Ramanathan tells us in a relatively old book called The English Vernacular Divide. In fact, a personal anecdote is likely to illustrate the point I'm trying to make here. 1995, Harvard University. It is a pleasantly sunny morning. In the course of a conversation about topics such as the relationship between class and color, the transaction between capitalism and colonialism, an American graduate student at the time doing his doctorate in English at Harvard tells me, curling up his lips into shreds of measured smile, "Your English is excellent, Mr. Hussain." I reply, "So is yours. And so fucking what?" Now, if we bring together the four forms of cultural production, that is to say the poem, the cartoon, the ad, and the anecdote that I have so far extremely quickly read, of course, owing to time constraints, I'm simply compelled now to skip certain minute, close details of my readings. And if we juxtapose Gramsci with Fanon, several interconnected theoretical points begin to emerge. First, individuals, classes, and institutions, because of their symbolic, discursive, as well as institutional power, are in a position to either badmouth or bewail imprecision, jargon, slang, and colloquial usage other than their own. Second, still following Orwell's injunction in both the metropolis and, within quote marks, the third world, there are those who still regard it as axiomatic that, I quote, "most people who bother with the matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way," unquote. Ah, the English language. Third, representative of this trinity for mixed voices was the American critic, John Simon, who died actually a couple of years back, 2019, I think, who said, I quote, "There is, I believe, a morality of language, an obligation to preserve and nurture its niceties, the fine distinctions that have been handed down to us," unquote. But power-laden and even hegemonic signifiers like obligation and morality evoke things or qualities other than linguistic values, duty, honor, and inevitably empire. Now, even an imperialist figure like Winston Churchill, as Richard W. Bailey tells us in an influential essay called English at its Twilight, that long ago, Winston Churchill himself asserted this, that the old political empire with its metropolis and colonial outposts has nearly disappeared, replaced by a cultural empire of English-speaking peoples. For many, this new idea has nearly erased the bad old idea of empire, so much so that the magazine Economist, not so long ago, celebrated, without paying heed to the struggles for national liberation in different parts of the third world. Yes, the Economist celebrated the alleged universality of the English language with bold headline. Headline is this: the new English empire. One thus might think of English in the era of late colonialism, a term that is simultaneously cultural and political economic, a term that, unlike much contested post-colonialism, significantly corresponds to what the Belgian political economist Ernest Mandel called late capitalism to describe our current conjuncture. Now I'm towards the end, I'm skipping, a number of things here, towards the end of my talk, but on the basis of certain insights that I have derived from Gramsci, Fanon, Volosinov/Bakhtin, and also Jean-Jacques Lesarcel, particularly the Lesarcel of the relatively recent groundbreaking work I'll called A Marxist Philosophy of Language, while also underwriting, expanding, modifying, nuancing, and even undermining some of them, I intend to advance 7 propositions or theses, or even some critical questions on English in the era of late capitalism and late colonialism. So number one, one cannot adequately grasp both the micrologics and macrologics of the production, exchange, distribution, and consumption of, that is to say, the very political economy of both English and Englishes without continuously locating them within the horizon of how 4 macro structures of both unequal production relations and unequal power relations, such as capitalism, imperialism, and racism, and patriarchy obtain and operate in their interconnections at both global and local levels. Thus, it is important to understand that what has come to be known as globalization is but a euphemism for the latest stage of US imperialism, within which we locate cultural imperialism, further within which we locate linguistic imperialism itself. Indeed, without accounting for all such interrelations, any discussion of what English is and what it does is bound to remain either inadequate or superficial. Number 2, English, by and large, thus continues to be the language of empire. There are people who don't think much about empire at this particular conjuncture, the pandemic-stricken, or this, because they think that empire has probably disappeared, but this empire is actually reconstituting and reconfiguring itself. I'm speaking particularly of US imperialism at this conjuncture. So let me return the point. So, English continues to be the language of empire and capital, both profoundly interconnected as they are, despite the fact that the Calibans of the world can write back and strike back in Englishes. 3, the aforementioned point, however, is not intended to suggest that English and Englishes do not have other uses. Of course, they have other uses. I, for one, do not summarily dismiss the importance of English as such. In fact, as you can see, I myself use English, and I teach English, and even taught the English language as well as English literature to native speakers of English themselves at American universities in my capacity as a full-time faculty member. Indeed, English has been made historically available to us in Bangladesh. Let's talk about this. It has been made historically available to us, to me. However, the question that I think we need to raise with full force are certain questions I want to raise with full force, which are, well, whose English is it anyway? What kind of English? What do you do with that English? And no less significantly, what do we say in that English, really? Is it enough to learn how to stage a verbal linguistic play in English such that we end up perpetrating violence on what is called standard English? Is it enough if you learn how to sprinkle local or indigenous words and phrases in English and even aim at some kind of linguistic chutnification? Is it, for instance, enough to say, Jumur, Jupur, Jupur, goes the rain? Such a configuration of interconnected critical questions is likely to provide at least a tentative, politically engaged, theoretical framework within which then we can approach the English question at both local and global levels. Now, number 4. In other words, indeed, one can be highly linguistically experimental and even linguistically iconoclastic, exploding bomb after bomb at the very roots of King's English or Queen's English, while at the same time remaining retrograde, reactionary, anti-people, and what the Chicana feminist theorist Tara Sandoval, in her theoretically and politically provocative work called Methodology of the Oppressed, calls undecolonized. If language itself is not deeply rooted in the struggle of people against those four macro structures of production relations and power relations I already mentioned in my first proposition. Number 5, let me now turn to Bangladesh again, a little bit, Bangladesh scenario today. Indeed, English in our country is by and large the language of money, power, prestige, and even pride. It is primarily and sometimes even exclusively used by the urban elite who simply relish forming an island in the country, in a country that has a rich history of anti-colonial language movement bearing the signs of people's blood. Most of those urban elites, although based and located in Bangladesh, do not know or even care to know Bangla or any other indigenous languages, despite ample opportunities to learn languages other than English itself. This scenario of ignorance, indifference, and reluctance is by no means ideologically and politically innocent. In fact, those who take pride in using English and in not knowing Bangla or not using it can rightly be called, in the language of Ngugi wa Thiong'o himself, shameless linguistic slaves, masquerading as they are as the urban and even the English department elite in our country. Number 6, English is being increasingly treated as a hot commodity in Bangladesh. In fact, the mushrooming of English medium institutions and private universities, as well as the decisively anti-people educational policies of the ruling classes, have largely contributed to the outrageous commodification of English. And this very commodification of English neatly responds to the market logic of today's late capitalism on the one hand, and contributes to increasing class polarization within Bangladesh on the other, thus reproducing and even legitimizing an unjust, unequal, and undemocratic economic, social, cultural order in the country. So I'm talking about private universities. Of course, there are exceptions, but I'm not interested in exceptions here. I'm interested in certain patterns that have already emerged. And last, but by no means least, last proposition, 7, the English departments in the third world and in Bangladesh always tend to run the risk. I'm saying tend to run the risk of morphing into micro colonies if those departments do not evolve decidedly anti-colonial, anti-Anglo-US Eurocentric vision, mission, critical lenses and methodologies and pedagogical practices. This is not to suggest that we have to remain simply indigenist, remaining isolated from the production and reception of knowledges and discourses from the West. In fact, if the English departments in our country, for instance, cannot play a significant role in advancing the cause of what the African revolutionary, anti-colonial revolutionary theorist activist Amilcar Cabral calls national culture. And if the English departments cannot enact productive and enabling transactions between the national and the international, those departments run the risk of turning into dangerous conduits of linguistic imperialism and by extension, cultural imperialism itself, to the detriment of our people who have made our education and even our lives possible. Power to the common ordinary people of Bangladesh. Power to all marginalized languages in Bangladesh and the world. Thank you. Thank you for listening.